to is not just the ability to express yourself. It's not just that the government is trying to censor publications or prevent their appearance, but is actually actively arresting journalists, professors, and judges in what seems to be an attempt to suppress freedom of expression entirely. But nonetheless, I'm going to insist on some of the ambiguities in the history of the freedom of expression. Then the first ambiguity is my first main point, and that is that the historical insistence on free speech began as a tool of opposition to the regime in power. So what I want to say is that freedom of expression was not just something out there that was a general principle. It actually becomes a principle because it is involved in it is part of a political struggle. So in my field, at the beginning of the French Revolution, when the crisis is just unfolding, when the Estates General is just beginning to meet in May of 1789, two of the men who would become among the most important leaders of the French Revolution, named Mirabeau and Brissot, the two of them began publishing newspapers, even though no publication of newspapers was allowed without government permission. So they ignored the fact that they should have government permission to publish their newspapers, and the government immediately suppressed those two newspapers. But this was actually the beginning of the struggle that would lead to the creation of freedom of expression as a principle. So in response to the government's suppression, Mirabeau famously responded with these words: 20 million voices, he means the entire population of France that is actually, more or less grown up. 20 million voices are crying out for press freedom. Nation and king are unanimous in their wish for help and ideas. But then we are presented with a ministerial veto after being misled by a treacherous and deceptive policy of tolerance. So here is an important sub-point to my point. Not only is freedom of expression originally part of a political struggle for power, but it also tends to become especially important in situations where the government is not entirely sure what kind of line to take. It wants to censor publications. It wants to be in charge of giving permission for them in the French case, but it also wants to be on the side of the modern, on the side of progress, which in the Enlightenment had already been tied to the freedom of expression. So the minute Mirabeau brings this up, he points out that the government can't decide whether it's going to be tolerant of the expression of opinion or it's going to try to suppress it. So the attempt to publish newspapers in May of 1789, before, in a sense, the revolution has actually happened, but in the midst of a political crisis, this was, in effect, an effort to contest the hold on power of the government, of the monarchy. The government tried to follow its usual policies of suppression, but it vacillated. It couldn't decide exactly how to proceed. The monarchy had already allowed the more or less free publication of pamphlets, that is, little publications of between 5 and 100 pages on a specific issue. They had allowed the free publication of pamphlets about the organization of the Estates General, which was then about to meet. But it did not allow newspapers. So the government wasn't quite sure. So the monarchy found that in the heat of the moment, when the Estates General actually began meeting, which is when these newspapers first appeared, the monarchy found that it could not enforce its policies as it had in the past. More and more deputies began to publish newspapers with commentary on political affairs, refusing to abide by the government's decrees about publication. So the refusal to go along with the suppression of opinion was crucial to the establishment of the principle of the free expression of opinion. So my first point is freedom of expression is not really a neutral idea. It actually first comes up historically in the midst of political struggle. Okay, my second point. The publication of news about politics and commentary on politics inevitably creates a new kind of public sphere in which representative government becomes more or less inevitable. Now, this is, to me, very important, that it's not just that freedom of expression is a principle. It's part of a struggle, but it's also part of a struggle that inevitably creates a broader public, that is, a broader sense of public opinion, because that's what the newspapers are about. They are about, in this period, in 1789, they are about trying to shape public opinion, yes, but by their very existence and the fact that people will read them, they create a public sphere in which there will be a much broader exchange of opinions. Not everyone's going to have the same opinion, but this public sphere that is created inevitably, I would argue, results in some kind of representative government. So if you have freedom of expression, you end up having more representative forms of government. Now, this will become important for various reasons that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. What do I mean? The British had considerable freedom of press after 1695. Why was this the date? Because they let what's called the Licensing Act just expire and not be renewed. So basically they said, we're not going to try to suppress the publication of newspapers. They will have to abide by certain rules, but we're no longer going to try to censor them before they appear. Why did the British do this? Because after the revolutions of the 1640s, but especially after the revolution of 1688-89, it became clear that you could have representative government that did not challenge elite control of the political order. Now, this is extremely important for the whole future of political life in the West, which is that freedom of expression does not it may mean representative government, but it does not mean that the elite necessarily loses control of the political order, because it is possible to control the press in various ways, manipulate the press in various ways, manipulate the political order in various ways, and maintain the elite in power, even in a representative form of government. Nonetheless, that publication freedom did mean that the monarchs could no longer rule on their own without Parliament, in the British case. So freedom of the press means that power has to be shared, but it does not mean that power will therefore inevitably become democratic. Those with money or connections can get control of various forms of publication. So if there is not a free market of publication, there is not real freedom of expression. And how to get a free market of publication is a problem which we face now, if anything, more than ever. Still, the fact that freedom of the press leads to power sharing between a ruler and some version of Parliament means that freedom of the press is deeply subversive of autocratic forms of rule. This is why autocrats inevitably attack freedom of the press. It is basically a life and death question for autocrats. The best example from my area of interest is Napoleon Bonaparte. When he came to power in 1799, he felt immediately that he had to maintain some semblance of a parliament, but he immediately shut down 60 of the 73 newspapers in Paris, saying, "If I give it free rein, I shall not remain in power for 3 months." So he understood that his hold on power was dependent on allowing only the tiniest bit of political expression in the press. The constitutions of 1791, 1793, and 1795 had all guaranteed freedom of the press in principle. But Bonaparte's constitution of 1800 did not. In 1805, his government reintroduced censorship prior to publication for newspapers. In 1807, his government reduced the number of theaters in Paris from 33 to 8 and set limits on the kinds of plays or operas each could perform. Big cities in the rest of France could have only 2 theaters, and their repertory had to be authorized by the local prefect. Control over print was even more stringent. The 4 newspapers allowed in Paris after 1811 and the 1 allowed in each department were closely watched by authorities. So that's the ambiguity. Autocrats hate freedom of the press, but they have to maintain some semblance of parliament, and yet parliament and freedom of the press also have a certain historical relationship. My third point, the declaration of a state of emergency is the ploy, the tactic of governments that wish to maintain their supposed democratic legitimacy, even while suppressing freedom of expression. Now, this is of course getting very much to what will happen in the centuries after the French Revolution. But to stay with my own field for a moment, the tragic example of this is the period in the French Revolution known as the Terror, in which the declaration of a national emergency justified the suppression of all forms of dissent and the arrest of suspects, now defined in very vague and broad terms. Now, I'm going into this in some detail because I want it to be clear that some of the issues we face in the present have a long history, one, and two, I think it's only historically fair and true to point out that supposedly left-wing governments have used the state of emergency as much as right-wing governments have. So the law known as the Law of 22 Prairial, that is the law of June 10th, 1794, famously in the Terror, denied legal counsel to those accused before the revolutionary courts and allowed only two verdicts, acquittal or death. Its notorious Article 6 read as follows, and I think you will see many echoes of the present. The following are deemed enemies of the people: those who would instigate the reestablishment of royalty, or have sought to disparage or dissolve the National Convention and the revolutionary and republican government of which it is the center. Those who have betrayed the Republic in the command of places and armies, or in any other military function, provided intelligence to the enemies of the Republic, or labored to disrupt the provisioning or servicing of the armies. Those who have sought to impede the provisioning of Paris, or to create scarcity within the Republic. Those who have supported the designs of the enemies of France, either by shielding the hideaways and impunity of conspirators and aristocrats, by persecuting and insulting patriotism, by corrupting the authorized representatives of the people, or by abusing the principles of the revolution, or the laws or measures of the government by false and perfidious applications of them. Those who have sought to inspire discouragement in order to favor the enterprises of the tyrants leagued against the Republic. Those who have disseminated false news in order to divide or upset the people. Those who have sought to mislead opinion and to prevent the instruction of the people, to deprave morals and corrupt the public conscience, to undermine the energy and purity of revolutionary and republican principles, or stop the progress thereof, either by counter-revolutionary or insidious writings, or any other machination. Those who charge with public office take advantage of it in order to serve the enemies of the revolution, to harass patriots, or to oppress the people. Finally, all who are designated in previous laws relative to the punishment of conspirators and counter-revolutionaries, and who by whatever means or with whatever outward appearances they disguise themselves, have made an attempt against the liberty, unity, and security of the Republic, or worked to prevent its strengthening. So this is a kind of incredible decree, which you can see lays the foundation for much of what follows, in the sense of legally defining incredibly large categories of people as potential suspects and prisoners and subject to the judgments of the revolutionary courts. So I wanted to make clear that this has its origins not necessarily just in autocratic governments, but in governments that declare the state of emergency in this particular kind of way. The difference, of course, in the case of France, was that France was engaged in a war with most of the other European nations and in danger of its very existence. And France had just established a republic for the first time in its history, and making the transition from monarchy to republic was far from simple or easy. So the revolutionaries found themselves pushed in this direction, but finding themselves pushed in this direction, people also began to realize the kinds of problems that could emerge with the state of emergency. Moreover, and this is important, very important for French history, the French revolutionary leaders, amongst them Danton and Robespierre, agreed to many harsh measures, at least in part to satisfy popular demands for them. The French deputies never officially declared terror the order of the day, but they were urged to do so by popular militants in Paris, especially those in the Paris city government. This demand was made in September 1793 as part of local efforts to answer to discontent about rising food prices. So there's a dynamic about the relationship of the government with certain elements of its popular support. But even earlier, the revolutionary government had begun to muzzle the press, despite the protestations, for example, of Robespierre in favor of freedom of the press as late as the spring of 1791. This is why the war that starts in April 1792 plays such an important role in getting the revolutionary leadership to think about suppressing that freedom. The revolutionaries did not reintroduce official censorship, as Napoleon did later, or the requirement of privileges, but it did intimidate its editorial critics, sometimes by encouraging militants to smash right-wing presses, and at other times subsidizing its own propaganda through the publication of pamphlets and even newspapers. Many journalists, such as Brissot and Camille Desmoulins, were sent to the guillotine. But the revolutionaries never repudiated the principle of freedom of the press. Moreover, they never used the expression state of emergency. Their justifications were almost invariably linked to the war. The crucial phrase for them was until the peace, jusqu'à la paix. Thus, the famous decree outlining revolutionary government proposed by Saint-Just on October 10th, 1793, began with Article 1, the provisional government of France is revolutionary until the peace. Revolutionary meaning that extraordinary measures could be taken precisely because they were viewed as transitory, not lasting, actions of a provisional, not permanent government. The state of emergency rationale, my fourth point, the state of emergency rationale has become ever more common, and now with COVID-19 is being declared in many places, though usually not with attacks on civil liberties, such as freedom of the press. The important point is that declaring an emergency is a sign of the weakness of governmental legitimacy, not its strength. This is, I think, this is one of the most important points to emerge from scholarship on the French Revolution, that the period known as the Terror was not a sign of a powerful government, like a totalitarian government, but rather the sign of a weak government that was desperate to ensure its control in a situation in which it was very much unsure of its control. Finally, however, it is worth remembering that freedom of expression got its first real defenders even before the French Revolution, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I'm happy to talk much more about this late in the discussion period if you would like to. Freedom of expression was not imagined as a public good or a human right before the 17th and 18th centuries. And again, I want to reemphasize, it emerges as part of political struggle. It doesn't just emerge as a kind of general idea. It emerges as part of political struggle. The English poet John Milton wrote what many consider to be the first defense of freedom of the press in 1644, right in the midst of the English Revolution of the 1640s and 1650s. And this is one of the things that he said. I love this quote of his, so you'll forgive me for reading a fairly long part of it. For books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them, to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. Nay, they do preserve as in a vial the purest efficacy and extraction of that living intellect that bred them. I know they are as lively and as vigorously productive as those fabulous dragon's teeth, and being sown up and down, may chance to spring up armed men. And yet, on the other hand, unless wariness be used, as good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Many a man lives a burden to the earth, but a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. It is true, no age can restore a life, whereof perhaps there is no great loss. And revolutions of ages do not oft recover the loss of a rejected truth, for the want of which whole nations fare the worse. We should be wary, therefore, what persecution we raise against the living labors of public men, how we spill that seasoned life of man, preserved and stored up in books. Since we see a kind of homicide, murder, may be thus committed, sometimes a martyrdom, and if it extend to the whole impression, a kind of massacre, whereof the execution ends not in the slaying of an elemental life, but strikes at that ethereal and fifth essence, the breath of reason itself, slays an immortality rather than a life. I wanted to end with Milton because his words make so much sense of how vital free expression is to the future of humankind, not just the present, not just our current problems, but as he says, the breath of reason itself, immortality rather than the life of us mortals. This is why in the end, I think, it is impossible to destroy freedom of expression, especially now that it is linked in so many minds with democracy and human rights. Autocrats can succeed for a time, no doubt, and often for longer than we can understand. But they do fail in the end because the human spirit is very hard to kill. Okay, that's it for my lecture. And I'm happy to move now into the discussion period. And we don't have to talk about this. We can talk about any aspect, any question that you might have that you want to raise. I'm here ready to respond to anything that might be on your minds, and it does not have to be directly about what I've just been talking about.
Thank you for this amazing lecture. It was very insightful. Now, people can send their questions to me. I will read them to you. In the meantime, I will read the questions that have been asked throughout the lecture. The first question is that history has been used many times by states in the past and is used even today to create national identity. However, after a while, people who criticized this and did not comply with this purpose emerged. At this point, how was it that historians who did not use history to create national consciousness were able to make their voices heard? How were these gains achieved?
Right. Well, so there's two different aspects. This is a great question. I mean, there are two different aspects that I think are worth thinking about. And one is there is the issue of those who are actually writing about national history who are not doing it to create national identity. But then there's a second part of this that I'd also like to bring up, and that is, because I know this is true for many of you, being interested in history of other places than your own nation, which is inevitably not about national identity. So I am not opposed to history being used to create national identity, because I think national identity is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think that history is most useful, we have seen over and over again, when those who are using it to talk about national identity are really interested in finding out the truth of how national identity is formed, and therefore are willing to incorporate the not so great aspects of national history into that national narrative. So in the United States, as you know, this is once again a very, very big issue, that teaching about racism is somehow denigrating national identity. I don't think this is true at all. The best national identity is one in which you can recognize the mistakes that have been made in the past, because every nation has a history of mistakes in the past. That's the way history works. We don't just always do the right thing. And this is especially true for places like the United States, which are based on taking territory away from native inhabitants and bringing in whole new groups of people to settle the land instead. So that has to be, for me, it's extremely important. It's also important to study the history of other places, in part so that people recognize their kinship to other people and not just to those who live in their national borders. So I'm not against national identity. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think actually it's a good thing, provided that it's open to discussions about the truth of the national past.
Thank you. Then I'll now ask the second question. It comes from Melih Örenkaya. He asked that, how do rulers ensure longevity of their reign by suppressing academic press?
By suppressing academic, yes. So, yes, this is one of the things that I was trying to get at, which is that the suppression of freedom of expression is actually very ambiguous, because usually absolute rulers, as they were known in the pre-modern period, or autocratic rulers, as we might think about them more now, actually have a kind of ambiguous relationship to freedom of expression. They want to control it. On the other hand, especially with the desire to compete with other nations who have more freedom of expression then becomes a marker of being modern, of being able to compete with other nations. So it creates a tension. You have to have a certain amount of freedom of expression, and yet you want to control it. So I think that's one reason why we see trying to suppress absolutely, and then trying to stand back because you realize this is not going to work quite the way you wanted to. Trying to suppress again, standing back. And so that was what was so interesting to me about in my own studies of the French Revolution, is that the revolution actually occurs because the government can't decide on one consistent line vis-a-vis the press, and can't enforce it. Can't enforce it because people at some point just say no.
Thank you very much. Then we have a question from Özge Işık. She says, many thanks for this enlightening talk. I wonder what questions does Professor Hunt think we should bring in if we were to put the issue of freedom of speech in a more global context, or to establish compatibility across space?
Yeah, I think this is an extremely interesting issue. And this is one reason why I of course, am a citizen of the United States, though I was born in Panama. I am a citizen of the United States. At the same time, I believe that it's extremely important to know. I study French history, so that's not my history. It's not my national identity. I'm very interested in the need for international history, for global history, precisely in order to be able to recover these kinds of links. So obviously, if you're in French history, you know that the debates about freedom of speech, free speech, about freedom of speech, many of them in France were influenced by the arguments in Britain earlier, but also, of course, in the United States during the struggle against Britain. The Dutch played a very important role in writing pamphlets about the meaning of these various different events and spreading the information about it throughout Europe. So nations learn from each other. There's no question about it. And they see what happens in other places. I mean, we can see this in the case of the United States, because many autocrats in different parts of the world, South America, certainly, the Philippines, various places, have learned from the tactics of Donald Trump, who is our would-be autocrat. And they learned about the manipulation of information, about how you could just tell lies and tell them over and over and over again, and X number of people would believe them. So people learn from the events in other places. So I think it's extremely important for us to study historically how these kinds of trends have traveled across space, and sometimes in very surprising ways. So that's a great issue.
Thank you again. The next question comes from Ceren Abi. She says, thank you so much, Professor Hunt. Would you tell us more about the post-reign of terror vis-a-vis freedom of press?
The post-reign of terror?
Yes.
Did you say? Yes. Yes. Hi, Karen. It's great to see you. I hope things are going well. She was a student at at UCLA, and so I know her quite well. Well, this is a fascinating period. The period after the fall of Robespierre is interesting to me, very interesting to me, because it's a period in which people who are sincere Republicans, but they still are, who want to have a republic and they don't want to return to monarchy, are desperately thinking through the options. For example, they want to have more freedom of the press, then they encounter political problems of their own, and there's some ambiguity about that. But this is a fascinating learning period from the mistakes of the previous period, the intense repression of the previous period. The people who succeed Robespierre want to figure out a way to have a republic that survives, but does not need this intense level of repression. And they work on it. As I said, they're not entirely successful. If you're hearing little cries in the background, it's one of my two dogs is excited about going outside. I tried to hide myself away where the dog could not be heard, but she'll be gone soon. Anyway, so this is what's so interesting is that, we learn from the things that have happened, and we develop ideas about what we need to do in the future. That's what's so interesting about the Thermidorian period, it's called, because it's a period of trying to figure out how to move forward. I went to China as a visiting scholar in 1985. It's a very long time ago, and things were very different in China. And my host there was the leading Chinese specialist on the French Revolution, which is why I was invited. And we had a very long talk one day in which he asked me, he said, "Do you think China is in its Thermidorian period?" And I thought this was very interesting because I wasn't sure whether he meant it was the period of figuring out what the mistakes had been in the Cultural Revolution and the repression that had surrounded the anti-rightist campaign and then the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, because this was the 80s, or whether he was worried that there was going to be a Napoleon Bonaparte at the end of this period. So that's one of the interesting things about the post-Robespierre period is it an attempt to set up a republic without repression, or is the government so weak that it will inevitably give way to an autocratic leader like Napoleon Bonaparte? So for me, this is fascinating, but I think that the basic bottom line is that we do think about the meaning of events, and we use history in part to try to figure out the meaning of events, because if we have a longer view, we tend to have a better sense of the kinds of options that are available.
Thank you, Professor. Next question comes from Meytan Ulu. She says, "We have talked about Milton's views. Can we learn more about freedom of opinions in artistic domains?"
Yes, well, that's very interesting because, of course, in the artistic world, in my period, in the French Revolution, the issue is it's not so much that artwork is specifically controlled, it's that the government, for example, is offering incentives to do paintings of certain kinds of things. So there's a way in which what people want shapes what the art world produces, but it's much more subtle. There's not the same kind of, it's more sort of self-censorship than it is that the government says you must not paint X kind of thing. So a perfect example of this is under the reign of Napoleon. Napoleon has a lot of painters who paint battle scenes for him that are meant to glorify Napoleon in some ways, but even some of the most famous of them, by the painter Antoine Gros, show the horrors of battle at the same time. So they have a kind of mixed, they're able to have a kind of mixed message. And in fact, I would say art, similarly to the world of print, the more you have of it and the more you have people participating in it, the more you create a world in which artistic opinion matters, the public of art matters. And I think this is a very important part of creating a public sphere, is when you have, it's not accidental that you have more and more public exhibitions of art at the same time that you are going to have more demands for newspapers. So one of the things the revolutionaries do during the French Revolution is that they abolish the Royal Academy of Painting and open the biennial exhibitions to anyone whose work is accepted by the jury, rather than limiting it just to Academy members. So there's a kind of democratization of art that goes along with the opening up of the press. So it's very interesting how the art world works with all of this.
Thank you. Yes.
And also, just to add to that, so I mean, we see this now because there are regimes that, you know, that certain filmmakers, for example, cannot live in their home countries, or certain painters like Ai Weiwei cannot live in their home countries because they would be arrested for doing things that are seen as subversive. So it is absolutely possible for art to be seen as subversive.
Yes, thank you. Our next question comes from Yusuf Talhabes. He says, first of all, I'd like to thank the professor for the lecture. I was going to ask if the notion of the human spirit having difficulty to burden debate could be reread with the criticism of reason, because reason tends to put its own creations to the pedestal and thus take it to a place where reason does not play a paramount role. Could we use this type of criticism in the same way?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm pretty much in line with the Milton view that reason is one of the most important, perhaps the most important quality in the human spirit. The thing is, so the question is, how does reason work most effectively? And my view is that reason works, this is the whole point about freedom of expression, that reason works most effectively, not just, Milton is talking about the creation of a person, and I think that is very important, like a book or a poem in his case. But that's not all there is. The really important thing about freedom of expression is the creation of a public sphere in which there can be the exchange of opinions, in which you get to a better version, not because one person has had a brilliant thought and used their reason so wonderfully, but because collectively, by the interchange and conflict of opinions, we're able to come to something better than any one person could have come up with on their own. So I'm much more, in that sense, I'm a believer in the collectivity of reason, not just the individual's ability to reason. I think that matters, obviously, as a beginning point, but it's the exchange of opinion that I think is so important. So for example, in the issue of teaching in the United States, it's not whether you should have this or that kind of approach. It's that you should be able to discuss the differences between different kinds of approach and let the students decide for themselves what they find the most compelling. So I'm a big believer in what happens when people get together, what happens when people communicate with each other, and how new ideas can emerge from that kind of interchange in a way that they can't emerge from an individual mind.
Yes, thank you. We have another question from Nesibe Dilekci. She says, you mentioned the restrictions on newspapers in France. What do you think about the difference between restricting the number of mass media and capturing them for political purposes?
Yes, well, this is of course the big problem of the present. Again, given what I just said about the importance of the collectivity and the exchange of opinions, I think it's very okay. So this is complicated because on the one hand, one wants to say there should be no restrictions on sort of the number of media, for example, but there is we are learning that the world of print, freedom of expression did not mean you could just say anything. There were, after all, libel laws in all places, that you could not defame somebody's you could not ruin somebody's reputation with lies. You could then be sued for damages. So it was free, but there were consequences in the legal system if you were going to say things that ruined somebody else's reputation. Now, those laws have also been used by governments to attack publications. There's no question about that. So there's no hard and fast rule that there's no consistent rule that we can come up with about this, because media in general are a good thing, but we have also seen how media can be controlled by certain financial interests. And then it's really not freedom of expression. It's really the expression of whoever is controlling the media, whether it's the government or a financial elite. The only solution to that is to figure out ways of preventing media from being completely controlled by a certain financial interest. And that's why there are rules against the sort of cartels of media combinations. And that's why there's so much worry about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. These are platforms that are, after all, controlled by commercial companies. And the issue is regulated. How should they be regulated? There's no obvious answer to this. This is something that, again, we need to discuss at great length, and we need to see how it works in our country. We need to see how it works in other countries. In other countries, they need to see how it works in our country to figure out our way through what is now a new landscape of freedom of expression, because there are so many different ways of doing it. And yet the idea that certain platforms can be used to create racist conspiracies, for example, in our country, to kill African Americans, that's a problem. So we have to figure out what to do about that.
Yes, thank you. We have a question from Ahmet Demirel. I'm reading it. One of the most important outcomes of the French Revolution was the nationalist movement. He played a role in the collapse of many states and the establishment of new states. In this process, administrators and politicians have also used history to serve their purposes. How important do you think the discipline of history is in the construction of nation states? To what extent have the rulers who wanted to build new nation states limited the freedom of expression of historians? Right.
Well, that's a great question, Ahmed. And of course, it's for anyone who works on the French Revolution. It's a crucial question, because this is a period in which new states are created, and some work and some don't work in terms of their long-term futures. Now, when the French take over places, even when Napoleon Bonaparte is in power, there tends to be a liberalization, actually, in many states. That is, they close monasteries, they limit the powers of the Catholic Church, they try to encourage the publication of newspapers, etc. But at the same time, the French also are not really creating new states, they are really creating clients of the French state. So one of the things that happens is that this experience of French occupation and of French trying to say, we have a better way of running things than you do, and so you're going to do what we tell you to do. That confrontation gets people thinking about what constitutes a nation. And so you have the development of nationalism in some places, like the German states or the Italian states, before you actually have the nation states that will eventually evolve from them. But again, it's like freedom of expression itself. It actually comes out of struggle. The sort of nationalism in that sense comes out of struggle. This is true, of course, in the Turkish case. The post-World War I Turkish state is a product of the struggle that is unleashed by World War I. And this nationalism in that sense is very much related to, in the case of the United States, the desire to separate from the control of another country. Sometimes it's independence from another country. Other times, Norway getting independent from Sweden, for example. Other times it's from an occupying force. This is true in the post-Napoleonic period. And so historians have not had to be enlisted in this fight. Historically, they have been very eager to play a role in creating national identity. And it turns out that history has been one of the chief forms for the creation of national identity, which is why I think it is still the case that there is so much controversy about what historians ought to be doing vis-a-vis national identity, because we have been implicated in this from the very beginning. The history has been, just as in your individual life, your identity depends on the narrative you develop about your parents and grandparents and where you came from and what it all means. Similarly, with nation states, there's a narrative. Where did the nation come from? And just that discussion is crucial to creating a sense of nationalism, which, as I said, I am not opposed to that. I think that there are many positive things to be said about national identity. I'm not opposed to national identity. It's a question of how that is framed and whether it's open to discussion about the defects of national identity.
Thank you, Professor. Next question comes from Peter Campbell. He says, I want to thank Professor Hunt for her committed and inspiring talk. My question is, what is the repression of free speech trying to do in the revolution? I mean, it's surely not a la Milton against reason. So is it just against criticism when they feel fragile? Is it against truth itself to make space for a government line, or against genuine misinformation like on the internet today, for example? What's their aim and target, both for the Jacobins and for Napoleon?
Yeah, so yes, for the revolutionary leadership in 1792, 93, 94, the problem for them was more, as I said before, the weakness of the government, the insecurity of the government, the fact that many people, one really big issue in France was that 50% of the population at least could not read. So what they understood of what was happening was quite unclear. So freedom of expression was not really affecting them in quite the same way as it was the reading public. So the government, one of the problems is that the government had real enemies and it had a lot of imagined enemies too. So the problem was they couldn't tell who was really opposed to the government and what they were doing to oppose the government. And they also had the really serious problem of not having they couldn't figure out a way to handle dissent within the revolutionary leadership itself, which led to the killing off of many of the revolutionary leaders, including in the end, Robespierre himself. So their situation is completely different from the situation of Napoleon Bonaparte. And it's much murkier, because officially the only people that they're going after are people who are going to try to publish, for example, royalist newspapers. But no one is really publishing officially royalist newspapers. They would have to be doing it secretly. And they were doing this through the courts. That police were not going out and rounding up journalists as journalists. They were only rounding up journalists who were accused of treason. And they weren't accused of treason, supposedly were not accused of treason for what they were publishing, but for other things. But as we saw, it was so general that it would be very hard to say exactly what it was they didn't like about the freedom of expression, other than that dissent itself was seen as undermining of the government. It's much clearer in the case of Napoleon Bonaparte, because what he basically does is just not allow many publications. He doesn't prevent the publication of books, but he's worried about books. So for example, he goes out of his way to write a very long book review of a book by Germaine de Stael, because he considers her an important dissident. And he publishes an anonymous review of her, attacking her. But for the most part, they just don't allow newspapers to be published. And what they do allow is carefully censored. And what happens with Napoleon is that his government is just spending a massive amount of time, as autocratic governments do, gathering information about possible opponents to the regime, not necessarily appearing in print, but just meeting together. He's got spies, police spies everywhere, trying to figure out who his opposition is, and he will arrest them, put them under house arrest, but he does not execute many people. In the case of the revolutionaries, it's a much more tense situation, because they don't have the personnel to have the same kind of police presence that Napoleon will have, because they have so many problems going on at the same time. They have the food problems, they have the religion problems, they just have a sort of an endless list of problems, and it's very hard for them to keep control of the situation. And in fact, they don't keep control of the situation. Napoleon gets control of the situation by basically not having a parliament that is meaningful, not having elections that are meaningful, not allowing political gatherings of any sort, and limiting the publication of any kind of political information. So he's got a lock on what people are hearing in a way that the revolutionary government does not. I'm afraid that's not an entirely satisfactory answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
Thank you, Professor. Another question comes from Cemre Altın. She says, we know that many historical records, primary sources were not kept. Secondary sources are also written based on primary sources. So how much do you think a historian can be trusted on such unreliable ground?
Yes, well, this is, of course, this is a great problem. And the only answer, well, there's a twofold answer. One is that historians have to take the lead, and they do, in insisting on the preservation of information. This has become extremely problematic in the digital age, because the number of emails generated by government officials, for example, is just astronomical. And it's not clear that those emails, for example, or any of the official documents actually represent what was going on in the government. So historians first have to agitate for the retention of documentation as much as possible and making it available to researchers. All countries have limits on what people are allowed to see, even in the documents that they have kept. So this is something that we must always fight against. The second part of the answer is, well, we have to do the best that we can do. Amit, for example, is working in a period of history, 16th, 17th, 18th century, where there's more documentation than there was for earlier centuries, but way less documentation than there is for now. And you have to do what you can do with what is available. We do the best that we can do with the information that is available, and we try to find, there are always new methods of finding information out about the past, new archaeological methods, new camera photographic methods from space. New information is always being revealed, but we can only do what we can do with what is available. And we have to do the best that we can with that and admit to problems where there are problems. That's why it's for all of these things, it's like with freedom of expression itself, there are always ambiguities and there are always tensions, and the best thing is to have public discussion of them.
Thank you, Professor. Next question comes from Oğuz Zengin. He asked, in determining whether an expression is in the domain of freedom of expression or not, where do ambiguities and disagreements stem from mostly, do you think?
Just say the last part, I didn't quite get it. The Zoom connection, I'm sure.
I'm reading again, okay. In determining whether an expression is in the domain of freedom of expression or not, where do ambiguities and disagreements stem from mostly, do you think?
Where do the ambiguities stem from in freedom of expression? Is
Yes.
that? Yes. Well, I think that the ambiguities stem from the uncertainty, frankly, about the notion of freedom. Freedom, really what freedom means is autonomy. That is the ability to make decisions for yourself. But it doesn't mean, freedom does not mean that you can just do anything. This is what the ambiguity of freedom of expression is about, does it mean that you can do or say absolutely anything? Well, we have huge debates about that. Does free speech mean, free speech does not mean that you can stand up at a movie theater and scream, the famous case, scream fire and cause panic. That is not considered free speech. So there are social limits, and in every society there are intense discussions about what those limits are. So we have an expression now in the United States called hate speech. Hate speech should not be allowed. That is speech that's denigrating of whole groups of people. But what is exactly hate speech and what is not hate speech? So freedom is an ambiguous concept, and there is no one way to resolve this because it's partly a social question, and it's also, that means it's a question that changes over time about what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Yes, those were all questions. I just got another one, sorry. This is the last question, and I won't be taking any because we have done with our time. The question comes from Emre Alpun. I'm reading it. Dear Professor, I'd like to clarify your point of view on the national identity and its effects over the society. How possible to possess and shape the national identity without creating us and other, and how come methods using to create national identity is not a suppressed tool for the right to free expression in the French Revolution vis-a-vis contemporary legislations? Isn't a national identity solely an amazing tool for hate speech?
Right. Well, I don't think so. I mean, so this is a very important question, because national identity like freedom of, I was arguing freedom of expression first arises kind of as a tool of an opposition to a government, to make its own place vis-a-vis the government. So it's a political act in its origins. And similarly with national identity is frequently something developed in opposition to other people, but it can evolve over time. And that's the part that I think that's where we are now in what is very interesting. So, for example, the United States is a kind of peculiar example because, in fact, when the United States was formed in the 1770s, the 1780s, 1790s, there actually wasn't any national identity. There was no national identity. So it had to be created. And of course, it was originally created as against the British, against British control, while at the same time maintaining strong, obviously, emotional ties with the British origins of many of the colonists. So for a long time, it was then shaped as Christian, European, white, etc. It was not so, it was written, it was interesting that Native Americans were largely ignored in narratives of national identity, rather than written, they were of course written against in the sense that Indians who resisted, Native Americans who resisted were described in unpleasant terms. But for the most part in the US, for example, in national identity, whole groups were ignored. The non-white, non-Christian, non-European parts of American identity were largely effaced until well into the 20th century. So yes, it often is written against other people, but it is also possible to change that and to develop a sense of national identity that is much less based on exclusion than the original ones are. So I would certainly don't want to argue that national identity is always an innocent or a happy vision of affairs, but I do believe it's an arena in which important kinds of debates can take place. And that's why I am not opposed to the idea that history serves national identity. It's a question of which national identity.
Thank you very much, Professor. Those were all questions, and thank you again for bearing with us with all this time. And this was an amazing lecture and amazing discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. And may I just say that if anybody would like to be in touch with me by email, you can find my email very easily by just going on Lynn Hunt, put in Lynn Hunt, UCLA, you'll get my email address, and I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns that people have that have come up during this period of time. And I thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you.